Good afternoon, everyone. Is this on? Yes? Yeah, good, good. I'm Sherry Goodman. I'm the Director of Education here at the Berkeley Art Museum and the Pacific Film Archive. And I'm very happy to welcome you to our program today, which is occasioned by the exhibition, The San Quentin Project, Nigel Poor and the Men of San Quentin State Prison. The exhibition was organized by the Milwaukee Art Museum, where it was curated by Lisa Sutcliffe. Here, the Berkeley presentation was organized by our Senior Curator for Asian Art, Julia White, together with Associate Curator Stephanie Canizzo. I'd like to, before anything else, acknowledge those whose support has made the Berkeley presentation possible. We extend heartfelt thanks for their major support to the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation, also to the Present Progressive Fund, Frisch Brandt and August Fisher, and Caitlin and Mike Krieger for their very generous support. Today's colloquium will begin with a presentation by Nigel Poor about the San Quentin Project. Then we'll hear from two distinguished UC Berkeley faculty, Jonathan Simon and Tina Sachs, and a UC student, Elisa Tambora, who will be speaking in lieu of Professor Genaro Padilla, who is unable to be here today. We're fortunate to have Jody Lewen, Director of the Prison University Project, here to frame the program, introduce the speakers, and moderate the discussion. So a brief introduction to Jody. Jody is the founder as well as executive director of the Prison University Project at San Quentin Prison, where she manages the only fully on-site program in the state prison system to confer college degrees. Unlike other prison education efforts, the Prison University Project at San Quentin does not restrict eligibility based on age, length of sentence, or type of offense, which results in an impact on the larger prison culture at San Quentin as well as on those enrolled in the program. Her program has dramatically reduced the recidivism rate of graduates. Among several prestigious awards for her work is last year's Frederick Douglass 200 Award, for which Jody was selected alongside Michelle Obama, Angela Davis, Bernie Sanders, and others who were so honored. Jody was also a recipient of the James Irvine Foundation Leadership Award in 2015. She continues to advocate for higher education opportunities for incarcerated people. So now I'm going to turn the program over to Jody.
Hello. A little bit has changed in the world since that bio was written, so just for the record, that's my error for not updating. But there are a whole bunch of other programs in the state today, thankfully, just so you all know. So welcome, and also I just want to say a few quick words, really, just of thanks and appreciation. There are a lot of very, very special people in the room right now, and this exhibit is very, and an event and Colloquium are all very close to my heart. I just want to say that, in particular, I want to give a shout out to Nigel for everything that led to this day and this exhibit. It's very hard to overstate the amount of work required to get a project like this off the ground. And I think a lot of folks who've been inside in whatever capacity will understand and sort of identify with the disconnect and the sort of surreality in a way of seeing an exhibit or events that take place in a setting like this one that sort of seek to represent what it's like inside. There's something so not tidy about the experience of living or working inside, and I think I just want to sort of acknowledge that sort of fascinating tension between the aesthetic and tidiness of the aesthetics and the tidiness of a museum setting and the reality of what it's like inside the system, and which I find that kind of collision both thrilling and complicated. So anyway, it makes me all the more grateful that we have the lineup that we have here today. Anyway, so I'm going to just introduce all the speakers, and then they will present one by one, and then I just want to acknowledge that Tina Sachs has a conflict, so we'll be arriving hopefully late, but we'll be here. So I'm going to introduce her for now in absentia. Nigel Poor is a social practice artist who began volunteering at San Quentin in 2011 as a professor for the Prison University Project, an experience that transformed, she says, her art practice. I would argue also San Quentin as a prison and the field, and certainly our organization. Her work has been exhibited nationally and internationally, and is held in the collections of SF MoMA, the De Young, and the Corcoran Gallery of Art. She is a professor of photography at Cal State Sacramento, and she is the co-creator, co-host, and co-producer of the award-winning prison-based podcast Ear Hustle, which turns out to be a tongue twister. Her exhibition, The San Quentin Project, Nigel Poor and the Men of San Quentin State Prison, which has occasioned today's colloquium, will be on view, so everybody knows, through November 17th. Jonathan Simon, who will speak second, is the Adrian A. Cragen Professor of Law and Director of the Center for the Study of Law and Society. He teaches criminal law, an advanced seminar on mass incarceration, sociology of law, and classes in the undergraduate legal studies program. His scholarship concerns the role of crime and criminal justice in governing contemporary societies. His past work includes 2 award-winning monographs, Poor Discipline, Parole and the Social Control of the Underclass, and Governing Through Crime, How the War on Crime Transformed American Democracy and Created a Culture of Fear. An incredibly important book, I just want to say. His most recent books are The Sage Handbook of Punishment in Society and Mass Incarceration on Trial, A Remarkable Court Decision and the Future of Prisons in America. And Jonathan has served as editor-in-chief of the journal Punishment and Society and as a reviewer for numerous law and society criminology and criminology journals. And Elisa, who stepped in for Genaro at the last minute, therefore her bio is on my phone and not on paper. Elisa Marie Tambora is an adult child of a formerly incarcerated parent. And an advocate for children impacted by the criminal justice system. She's an undergraduate transfer student at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She's in her 3rd year as a legal studies and philosophy double major. She's also an intern for the Center for Public Philosophy at UC Santa Cruz, and a member of the UCSC Family Services Advisory Committee, and a peer mentor for the Black Academy, a university transition program for Black identified students. She's also the founding director of Walls to Bridges, a restorative justice program for incarcerated parents and their teen and young adult children. Elisa plans on attending law school directly after finishing her undergrad. She's an avid writer and storyteller and is currently authoring a children's book. By sharing her experience, she hopes to raise awareness of the power of family reunification and connection to heal traumas of incarceration. Tina Sachs, who, as I said, will be arriving late, is an assistant professor at UC Berkeley School of Social Welfare. She works in the areas of racial inequities in health, social determinants of health, and poverty and inequality. Her current research, investigates the persistence of racial and gender discrimination in healthcare settings among racial and ethnic minorities who are not poor. This year, Oxford University published her book on this subject, Invisible Visits, Black Middle-Class Women in the American Healthcare System. Professor Sachs is also the principal investigator on 2 projects on immigration and health, and leads a study in gender dynamics and food stamp participation among Latina immigrants in California. Her work has been published in Race and Social Problems, Qualitative Social Work, Family and Community Health, Health Affairs, and The New Yorker. In 2017, Tina co-taught, together with Jonathan Simon and Keith Feldman, a signature UC Berkeley Big Ideas course entitled The Prison. So we're going to start with Nigel.
Okay, all right. First, I just want to thank everyone for coming here on a Saturday. That's very nice. I hear you could be at a football game instead, so I appreciate you being inside. I appreciate the invitation, and Sherry, thank you very much for organizing this. It's a pleasure. And Elisa, huge thanks for you to step up at the last minute and present. It's a real honor to have you here. I'm a huge fan of your dad, who was actually one of my students. So it's great to have you here, so thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to, in 8 to 10 minutes, give a brief kind of history of how I got to be doing this work inside San Quentin. And can you hear me? Fine. Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is going to be a brief kind of overview of how I've worked with various narrative projects with incarcerated men at San Quentin. And all of the work that I've done, which includes work with images, Reuben, wow, sorry, which includes work, another person I greatly admire, images, words, and sounds, but all of these mediums come from the same concern, and that is to remember that you can start with fact or fiction, but inevitably one will recall the other. And the other thing that I always keep in mind is that the beauty and complexity of the experience is found in the small details, the overlooked, and the undervalued. So whatever I do, I always have those things in mind. So with that, I'm going to dive into the collaborative work I've been doing at San Quentin since 2011. As Jody mentioned, I started my involvement at the prison by working for the Prison University Project, teaching a history of photography class. And in the class, the men were not allowed to use cameras, but I wanted them to get the experience of what it was like to actually create something tangible. And so the first thing I asked them to do was to recount a really important memory and do it using photographic concepts like perspective, point of view, focus, scale. And I wanted them to create what I call a verbal photograph of that memory. And with this exercise, the words became an invitation to delve into a memory and a personal narrative. And in a sense, their words escorted us through an experience. The words are an invitation to participate in a vital memory. So if you look at this, although it's not a photograph, it's a written document, and read the language, you note that the student is saying, if you look behind the light bulb, you will see. If you turn your attention, you will notice. Just the way you kind of interact with a photograph if you're holding it, it creates an intimate experience. On the second part of the paper, he says, this memory means so much to me because it's what I perceive to be the earliest memory of my mother. And what I really love about that statement is that it not only speaks to memory and how unreliable it can be, it also speaks to the power of photography, which is that photography can hold memory, but it can also create memory. And it's not always important if it is the truth. And when I talk about truth, I'm not talking about, don't confuse it for talking about Trump's truths. I'm talking about something that's much more esoteric, that's much more creative, and that again is that we are always, in our experience, commingling fact and fiction. From that assignment, we went on to do something else where we brought in images by well-known photographers and asked men to, what I call, map them, which was to take the image back to their housing unit, live with it, and on one side, dissect what you see on the top, the subtext of the photograph, all the clues that are there, all the things that give meaning to that photograph. And then from that dissecting and mapping, create a narrative based on their experience of that image. And one of the things that I really love about photography is that it's an open, generous form, meaning that anybody can look at it and insert their own experience into it. And that's exactly what happened in this exercise. So Marvin, who did this piece, insisted that this was a gas station near the corner where he grew up in LA. It didn't matter how many times I told him it wasn't. He insisted that it was. And if you look at the narrative, you can see, if you read it, you can see that there's a very complicated family tree at the bottom, and the whole narrative is about an experience that he had before he was incarcerated. And again, that just adds kind of the beauty to the idea that photography is open to anyone's experience or interpretation. Working on this project prepared me for what was to come next, which was working with this amazing archive of images taken at San Quentin between about 1938 and 1982. And this is the bulk of the project that's currently up in the gallery. So these images were taken by correctional officers. There's not a ton of information about what they are. Some of them have dates and some of them have titles, but it's this really open-ended mystery. So my first idea with getting these negatives was to scan them all, to archive them, and try to understand all the photographs by putting them in various categories. So I just want to show you a few of the images. They're interesting in and of themselves, I think, because they give us a peek inside prison, but they also remain a bit oblique because we can't know exactly what's happening. This is a good example. So this has a date and it has information on it, and it says stabbing in the gym, but I don't know if this man is alive or dead, if he's being held up by these arms, if he's about to get up off the table. Why did this stabbing happen? All of the kind of facts of the image are not there for us. So I wanted to think of a way to open up these images, and what I ended up doing was working with a group of men to map these images just like we did in the assignment for the Prison University project. And so what you see here is the difference between the image as kind of a blank document coming out of a sort of mysterious archive, and then the way it's transformed after somebody's interacted with it. And if you read this piece that Ruben wrote, it's really one of my favorites, and it always kind of takes me by surprise, because the way he talks about this image is not about the stabbing, not necessarily about the violence, but as this man being an architectural form, a fallen cathedral that's being buttressed by these two arms, one good and one evil. And as a cathedral, he's in the middle of this, trying to decide which way to go. And I would say that that is one of the most creative and poetic interpretations of what on the surface is a very disturbing image. But because Ruben had had experience in prison and is a very thoughtful man, he was able to look at this and bring something really tender and poetic out of it. And that's one of the things I'm always interested in, is how we can look at the everyday and the seemingly unimportant and find beauty in it. And I believe that all of us have the capability of doing that if we're given the opportunity. It doesn't matter where we are, if we're inside prison or outside prison. The other thing with all of these projects is to really encourage people to think differently about what's happening inside prison and what potentially could be happening inside prison, that they could become places that are much more about education and rehabilitation, not just a place where people mark time. I'm staying at 8:15. I'm doing okay. All right, I'm going to talk very briefly about the third project that I'm working on, which is the podcast Ear Hustle. This is a prison-based podcast about everyday life inside San Quentin, told from the perspective of those who live it. It's not a crime podcast. Again, it is about the everyday, and it's a way of, again, reminding people that the important stories are in the small details, the overlooked and the undervalued. And I want to play just a short clip from one of our first episodes about a guy named Roach. And he's somebody who loves critters. And while he's been inside prison, he's taken care of lots of different animals. And for me, this is really a narrative, a personal narrative about love and how you find love and how you give love in a place that doesn't always welcome that experience. So let me just play this little clip for you.
I love animals, oh yeah. Since I've been in prison, I've had black widows, tarantulas, a lot of grasshoppers, beetles.
At San Quentin, inmates aren't allowed to have pets, but some guys get creative, like Roach here.
Gophers, rabbits, I had 4 swallows, a toad, praying mantis, 21 snails, frog, a red-breasted finch whose arm broke, pigeons. I had a desert mole that was partially paralyzed, teddy bear hamster, just really lazy with an attitude, the centipede, and it was a wolf. It was a bad little monster. I had 2 fish that had babies twice. I had a tarantula broke out one time. My cellie said, "Yo, spider got out."
I don't know how many times I've heard this clip. I'm sure it's well over 100, but every time I hear it, I'm brought back to how delightful it is and how just making a list and if you break this down, all he's doing is making a list of animals that he's owned. But through that list, you learn so much about his personality. You learn about how he sees the world, what he values, how he creates friends out of these creatures that most people think you can't communicate with. And it becomes a very powerful personal narrative in 49 seconds. So sometimes the smallest bit can add up to the most beautiful, generous experience to share with others. So I'm going to end it there and look forward to hearing what other people have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. I feel like I got a little taste of the photography class, which I would love to take. So I want to start with kind of a personal reaction to the photos in the exhibit, and two aspects that are related to me and that have a common theme, which is just the humanity of the people you see in those pictures. And I don't know if that's just a feature of photography, that it can't help but capture us in our sort of humanity. But there are two aspects of that I want to kind of think about for a moment. One is to acknowledge that there's just a kind of unbridgeable divide between those of us for whom incarceration is primarily an idea, even if it's an idea that we visit sometimes, and those who have lived it in some way, whether it's because they've been inside or because they have a loved one that has lived inside. There are very few people, and Jody and Nigel may be among them, that can kind of go back and forth between the idea and the place as a place that you actually live. I'm not one of them. For me, it's primarily an idea. And by looking in this room, I'm hoping that there are people among us for whom it has been a lived experience. And I hope that you will share, if you feel able to, some of your reactions and your thoughts with us this afternoon, because we're going to have time for that. The other thing that struck me about the sort of humanizing aspect of the photography is it kind of takes these people out of time. You kind of I found myself looking at the pictures going like, what decade is this? You know, what cigarettes are on the desk, or are there cigarettes on the desk, because they've been banned at San Quentin for about 25 years now, I think. There's a kind of ahistorical quality, and part of that is the nature of the prison itself, which has now been with us for close to 300 years as an idea, and here in the United States, over 200 years as a real institution. And what I'd like to do this afternoon is just take San Quentin for a moment back to several moments in history, because at each of those moments there have been people just like that who could have been captured maybe with photography, whose humanity was certainly there. But with the idea that we have to maybe talk about today, which is, why do we keep coming back to this idea of the prison? Why can't we let it go? Can we imagine a world that actually doesn't rely on caging people as its response to violence? And indeed, we can talk about whether caging people even begins to be a response to violence as in any adequate way. So let me take you back first to a moment 165 years ago when San Quentin prison was built, or at least the first building on it was erected. The name San Quentin is a kind of pastiche. From the histories I've read, it was known originally as Point Quentin, after an indigenous leader who the Spanish had defeated nearby. So coloniality runs through the entire history of the place. What's amazing to recognize is that in 1852, when the prison started to be constructed by the slave labor of its own prisoners, California was a brand new state. It had no capital. There was no university. The state was essentially too poor to do anything, but it built a prison. And it's a remarkable fact about our imagination of what it is to be a state, that we built a prison before we did almost anything else. And we weren't alone. This is happening around the world. Roughly the same time, Lima, Peru decides to build a prison. And these are roughly equally peripheral places in the world in some ways, although the gold rush has made San Francisco a kind of instant city. Why did we do it? The history of the prison has always been about dreams and about fear. So the fear was a fear of both what it meant to have a city full of people who had essentially arrived overnight. San Francisco became the most international, heterogeneous city that the world had perhaps seen since the Roman Empire, and in a very brief period of time. People brought boats, came in boats from all over the world, and it was actually a boat that the first prisoners were hauled out to Angel Island on and eventually put on Point Quentin, where they built the first prison building that was called the Stones. The dream at that point was the dream that it could all be done for nothing. And this won't surprise you that well-connected politicians made deals to try to make money off the slave labor of prisoners and promised to make sure that the state would never have to pay any money for it. And the first building was called the Stones, and it actually lasted until 1959. It was still erect. It had 48 cells, and soon over 300 men were kept in those cells. One of the other reasons, and this struck me looking at the photos, that we kind of keep coming back to the dream of the prison, is that it promises to be a punishment that doesn't touch the body. And one of the things that really struck me about the photos is how much the body is there. The wounded body, the body in fear or tension, sometimes the body in repose and in connection with others, but it is a place of the body. And indeed, the Stones and almost all the prisons in the 19th century relied heavily on the whip as the only way to accomplish any kind of control, as well as essentially what was known as Estelle's parole system. Estelle was the politician who essentially became the contractor, took over the prison population. Essentially, you got to escape if you worked diligently enough for Estelle for a while. So that's 1854 when we committed ourselves to this idea. Within a couple of decades, it became clear that having private profit-making contractors run the prison was a scandal, that it couldn't work, and the state had to confront the reality that it was actually enormously expensive. In the first decades that the state took over San Quentin, essentially a third of the state budget was spent to maintain that prison. So the next dream that came along, and the next place I want to visit really quickly, is 137 years ago in 1882, when there was another moment where people said, like, why are we doing this? Marin had already become a pretty settled place. People said, let's sell off this prison. We can reconsider how we're dealing with this situation. Instead, they doubled down and they built a jute mill. The idea was to create a factory inside the prison that would again make it profitable and somehow allow the prison to pay for itself. This jute mill, jute is a fibrous plant material that they made agricultural bags out of. Why did they choose a jute mill? Partly because of the state's obviously huge agricultural business, partly because the only business in the state that made jute bags was a Chinese-owned business. And the prison has always been about racial advantages. And so they could put one Chinese-owned business out and create this state form of monopoly on jute. They did it. This prison factory was kind of like a factory that Dante would have invented. It ran at its peak 3 shifts a day. You lived among just whirring industrial looms and a constant flow of fibers that sort of like black lung disease that got into your lungs. So it was a kind of torture on the installment plan is what I would call it, sort of day in and day out working in that jute mill. And again, it struck me when you look at some of the scenes of work in the prisons, in the San Quentin photos, not a lot of them, because actually the prison as a fantasy that you could make prisoners work and that work would pay for the prison had collapsed before the 1950s when you see the first of, I think, most of those photos. So let me take you to that next moment, which is sort of the 1950s through the 70s, which is where I take it most of the photos seem to have come from in that period. A lot of them are in the 60s, but some are in the 50s. This is, again, a period where we might have just gotten out of the prison business. The prison population hit a nadir after World War II. Lots of people had paroled right from San Quentin into the war effort, and we might have just decided to do away with it. Instead, we decided, oh, well, let's really make rehabilitation work. And this was sort of the heyday of San Quentin as a place committed to rehabilitative penology, and I want to come back to this because I think the fantasy of rehabilitation is part of the dream that we need to awaken from in some ways as we talk about what it means to keep having prisons even today. But this was the era where we were supposed to be doing therapy on prisoners. What was the main kind of therapy? Bibliotherapy. San Quentin had a library of over 50,000 books at that time, most of them works of history, philosophy, literature. Prisoners essentially competed to read books. Many of them wrote. The kind of prison writer of this era, Carol Chessman, later George Jackson, is really coming out of this moment of sort of high expectation for the possibility of education and knowledge. But it's also the moment, 1959, the very year that the Stones, the first of those structures built by prison slave labor, was torn down. They built, in the midst of this new rehabilitative penology, a new building they called the Adjustment Center. And the Adjustment Center would be a place that they would put the people that they felt they couldn't rehabilitate. It's the place where George Jackson ultimately died in 1971 during a still unexplained uprising in that center. And as you look at some of the photos, the woundings, and we don't know the stories behind those woundings, but this is a period where San Quentin and other prisons in the state are undergoing a tremendous transformation as we move from a sort of Jim Crow white supremacy prison to a multiracial prison, a civil rights struggle inside the prison, which inevitably takes very violent scenes and may explain at least some of those crime photos. So I want to close by saying we're now in another extraordinary moment where San Quentin is still there, and ironically, despite being 165 years old, it's now offered to us in some ways as the most promising, most progressive prison in the state. And I do think this is another moment where we have to seriously ask ourselves whether caging people, even in the best settings possible, even where there are volunteers, professionals, where there is the possibility of medical care and mental health treatment, other things that are systematically lacking in many of our other prisons, we still have to ask ourselves, even in the best of conditions, even when we do see people tremendously do tremendous work on themselves and with each other, is caging people what we have to do if we want to live in a society with less violence? I've slowly in my own life come around to thinking of myself as a prison abolitionist, inspired by the work of Angela Davis, Ruth Gilmore, Paul Butler, and others. And I just want to encourage you that it's okay to think about abolition. Just saying the word isn't going to fling the doors open and raise the crime rate tomorrow. In fact, abolition is always a partial project. It's always a work in progress. We could do a lot to just reduce our need and our reliance on caging without getting to the people that may scare you in your mind, and a lot of them aren't as scary as you think. So let me stop there. I think I've gone over, and invite up our next speaker, Elisa. Elisa, thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today and asking me to speak a little last minute, but I'm glad to be here. I want to start by sharing a story with you. I know a little girl who wrote a poem to her father. It said, "I love you with all of my heart. I wouldn't know what to do if we were apart. I'd cry and cry all day long until someone would comfort me with a song. I hope that we would never separate, never. I want to be with you forever and ever." About 1 year after she wrote this, her father was sentenced to 15 years in prison. And that little girl that wouldn't know what to do if she was apart from her father had to face that separation and what her new life would bring. My name is Elisa Tambora. I'm an undergraduate reentry and transfer student at UC Santa Cruz. I'm a double major in philosophy and legal studies. I characterize myself as a writer and an activist. I also characterize myself as an adult child of a formerly incarcerated parent and a staunch advocate for the rights of children impacted by incarceration. I was asked to speak with you today about the narrative of incarceration, and I plan to do this with an emphasis on familial incarceration. Incarcerated men and women are not just incarcerated men and women. They are incarcerated brothers, sisters, sons, daughters, fathers, mothers, and friends. And as our last speaker said, at the time when all of these photos were being taken at San Quentin, where were their families? Where are the people on the outside? As part of my current coursework at UCSC, I've been thinking about the questions: what exactly is punishment? Why do we punish? How and whom do we punish? I've been coming to think that punishment is not simply incarceration itself or the imprisonment of one's body, but rather the severing of social connections, social and family connections. That is done by placing individuals in prisons far away from their families. This is done by stringent visiting policies and harrowing visiting experiences. And this is done by the revocation of family communication on the basis of the incarcerated individual's behavior. These are all means of social disconnection. And these experiences are traumatic enough to discourage and break families, but not enough and not in a way that would warrant a widespread and mainstream investigation of family separation and incarceration. If one end of incarceration is to socially and psychologically harm someone or to torture their soul, then one means of doing so is through traumatizing and breaking one's family unit. My point is, incarceration does not just begin and end with an incarcerated individual. An organization called Justice Strategies published a report called Children on the Outside, voicing the pain and human cost of parental incarceration. And their data show that family instability for children of incarcerated parents creates a tidal wave effect. Not a ripple effect, but a tidal wave effect that results in further separation from other family members, friends, and communities. There are 2.3 children in America that have an incarcerated parent. 2.3 million children. Black children are 7 times, and Latinx children 2.5 times more likely than white children to have an incarcerated parent. So incarceration is also the disintegration of social health. It's an instrument to injure children and break communities disproportionately of color. And we know that the war on drugs in the 80s and 90s and its accompanying crime and sentencing policies largely explain this evolution of mass incarceration. We know that this accounts for much of the pain caused to children who have lost their parents to long prison sentences. So we have a generation of Black and brown children, my generation, that have suffered. They have an undermined sense of stability, economic instability, a loss of positive and healthy attachments, a sense of having no place in the world, and an increased likelihood of engaging in antisocial behavior, drug use, school failure, unemployment, incarceration themselves, and mental health issues. We also have this generation of children of incarcerated parents who feel a compromised sense of connectedness and worthiness, that they are not lovable, not deserving of support, and that they should be ashamed and hide who they are. Their parents are sentenced to prison and jail, and they are sentenced to stigma and secrecy. One facet of facing this issue of mass incarceration in our country is promoting the welfare of children and committing ourselves to family reunification and family healing. So what does this have to do with narrative? Well, I think it has everything to do with narrative. I think narrative is at the heart of the solution. For those who have an overwhelming sense of feeling invisible and unworthy, narrative is a powerful tool to giving them a voice and letting them know that they matter. It's a tool to utilize for processing through and healing the trauma of incarceration, and it is a tool to educate and bring awareness to those who do not share that same lived experience. Most importantly, though, narrative explicitly and exclusively gives us the necessary information for tackling the issue that is mass incarceration and mass family separation. Narrators of incarceration are experts in the problem, and I think are experts in the solution. I think the power of narrative comes from the use of it and its narrators as a source to create and implement substantial solutions. Policymakers, community leaders, and educators have the opportunity for considerable gains when room at the table is made not just for the narrative, but the narrator. In criminal justice reform, there is importance for them to be bridge builders, to be channels who can identify and provide access to the narrative of incarceration. For example, not everyone who is a parent can identify with being an incarcerated parent, but everyone who is a parent can imagine the pain of being separated from their children. Narrative provides these access points for more social connection and integration of different groups to band together and create much-needed resources and opportunities. I like to call this the fatal flaw of incarceration. It's the thing that binds us together in a common humanity that allows us to work across class, racial, gender, educational, and generational lines. It's another avenue in criminal justice reform that allows us to reduce the social and emotional impact of incarceration. Now I want to provide you with an example. So what about that little girl from the story who wrote the poem to her father? She grew up without him, and she grew up angry and resentful. She refused to talk to him until one day she visited him in San Quentin after 10 years of no contact. She cried, she spoke her truth, and she went home feeling drained but empowered. And the girl who couldn't write for 10 years about the pain she felt around her father being gone took out her notebook and began writing again. She wrote her narrative of incarceration, but she didn't stop there. she was encouraged to use it. That girl is me. I thought that by sharing my personal narrative, the people in my life would confirm what I thought was the truth. That I wasn't good enough, that I was irreparably damaged, and that my story wasn't worth being heard. Instead, when I finally started sharing my narrative, I was met with compassion, encouragement, and resources. I was connected to Project What, We're Here and Talking with Community Works West, an organization that works with youth impacted by incarceration. I called the project manager, and she quickly wrote me in to work with our organization. And that was the beginning of me using my voice. I didn't do this alone. I was supported by community members and organizations, my professors, scholars, policymakers, my family and friends. People opened a seat at their table for me and my narrative. The very same people, alike to those who are sitting here with us today, people like you. 2 years ago, I sat on the core planning committee for the Bay Area's first ever conference on children of incarcerated parents, sponsored by the Alameda County's Children of Incarcerated Parents Partnership. And the same person who was terrified to share her story stood up in a room of a couple hundred people and opened the event with a poem called Wait. I said, I know you didn't mean it. I didn't mean for us to only exist on some Saturdays. From 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., through bars and through windows, hearing about my waves in life from everything and everyone except my own ocean. Saying goodbye because you've forgotten what it's like to tell me good morning. Holding your breath to cope with the fear of never knowing me as your daughter again. Writing me letters you know that I'll never return, know that I'll never learn to forgive you, to love you, to believe in you, and to admit that I want you to come home. What is my narrative saying? What do I mean when I say, hearing about my waves in life from everything and everyone except my own ocean? I don't want my life filtered through everything. Phone calls, letters, cards, public visits, and everyone. My family went to see him. My grandma saw him every Saturday. What were they telling him? What I'm saying here is that I want to tell my father about me, about Elisa, and not just face-to-face, but heart-to-heart. My narrative helped me think deeply about the breakage of my relationship with my incarcerated parent and what I thought I needed to heal. It helped me connect with others impacted by incarceration, specifically children and adult children. It helped me collect the experiences of incarcerated parents in my volunteer work. Our common narrative identified a fundamental problem of familial incarceration, which helped me identify an innovative solution. It sparked my idea for Walls to Bridges. Another interesting find from the Children on the Outside report is that some children who visit their incarcerated parent actually may be re-traumatized because visitation activates the attachment system without affording opportunities to work through the intense feelings of being separated from their parent. Walls to Bridges is a pilot program created to mitigate that harm. It's a program I'm launching in Santa Cruz that aims to facilitate restorative justice dialogues between incarcerated parents and their late teen and young adult age children. The purpose of the program is to help heal parent-child relationships by providing a safe space to share about the impact of incarceration, to begin to restore healthy communication, and to construct a plan for future communication if desired. Another intended outcome of this project is to generate a compelling account of the exponential effects of incarceration on family communication. We wish to inform the public of these challenges, and we wish to amplify the voices of those who are still suffering in silence. The outcomes of the program will also inform potential expansion and replication, as well as later policy recommendations in Santa Cruz. The heart-to-heart that I realized I was seeking with my father, I get to now facilitate for those who have experienced the trauma of dissolved parent-child relationships. Not only do I get to do that, but I get to test a model of a program that may have the potential to make a lasting impact in restoring parent-child relationships and promoting the social health that incarceration is designed to dissolve. And I'm not doing this alone. Craig Haney, professor in legal studies and psychology at UCSC, is my sponsoring faculty. I'm being mentored by faculty in the psychology, sociology, legal studies, politics, and philosophy departments. I have a team of 5, including myself, UCSC undergraduates, that are the student investigators and restorative justice mediators, and all of us have been impacted by incarceration. We are funded by the Donald A. Strauss Foundation. We are working with community organizations in Santa Cruz, specifically the Conflict Resolution Center, and we're looking forward to our upcoming partnership with the probation and sheriff's departments. The group of people working together on this project is impressively interdisciplinary, inclusive, and diverse and rich in experiences and resources. These overlapping connections are reversing the tidal wave effect of incarceration that destroys communities. We are different, but we are standing together in solidarity to change the narrative of incarceration from one of pain to one of healing. And this is what I think is the power of narrative. It starts with giving voices to the experiences of those impacted, people like me, and it continues by uplifting those voices so they can grow into tangible, positive changes that heal the trauma inflicted by mass incarceration. I am the power of narrative. The incarcerated are the power of narrative. Families of the incarcerated are the power of narrative. And I think you are the power of narrative. Thank you.
I wouldn't want to follow that act, but is Tina here? I think not yet. Okay. Then I want to invite the speakers up, and we will begin our conversation, and if she arrives, we will segue back to her and then come back to the discussion.
On. I do a podcast, you know.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of contact with microphones in my line of work. I want to start, first of all, by thanking the speakers. I'm so thrilled for this combination of minds. And I want to just first start by just asking whether you all have any thoughts or ideas that you want to share in response to each other. And obviously, if not, we can continue. Do you want to?
Well, it's just, there was a lot that Elisa said that really stuck with me, but one thing in particular was it's not just the narration, it's the narrator. And I think that's just a really important point to make, that you can tell as many stories as you want, but if the person who isn't the author of that story isn't made visible, there's a problem. So I was really happy to hear you say that. Thank you. It's more maybe a comment.
One thing that really just powerfully hit me in your talk is one of the fantasies of the prison is that it's only about the person that you're punishing, that you're somehow, this person is being held accountable and that they're being punished. But of course, you're not just punishing them, you're punishing their loved ones and everyone who has to either go through the experience of even navigating the prison to get to their loved one or are completely
John,
cut off.
Hold the mic even closer.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Gracefully told you that as you were finishing saying what you wanted to say. So that's great.
Did people hear me? I just meant that we have to take, if we took seriously, and I think maybe starting to with voices like Elisa's coming out, the impact that punishing people with incarceration has on their loved ones, it would seem a lot more commonsensical, or a lot less commonsensical than it does to too many of our fellow citizens still today.
I think I just want, can you guys hear me? Okay, good.
It's for the recording that the...
Oh, okay. I think I just want to say thank you. Thank you for having me here, and thank you, Nigel, for your work, because I can come up here and I can speak about, you know, the narrator and the narrative, right? And you are someone who really embodies these principles of being inclusive with your work, and I really appreciate, as a family member, the work that you are doing, and I appreciate everyone here for missing the football game, right? And coming to here, because these are important issues. Thank you.
So wonderful. A couple of other thoughts I just wanted to put out there. One is a deep appreciation for Jonathan's cynicism about the narrative of rehabilitation. And I just wanted to say for the record, the goal is not 2.5 million people in prison, all of whom have access to high quality higher education. Just want to make that clear, but I really appreciate that. I think that's something we have to hold in mind. I think of a lot of the ways in which we deploy the narrative of rehabilitation as perhaps a subversive strategy, but certainly not a goal that should be left unexamined. But I also just wanted to point out one thing that strikes me is the theme of the institution throughout. You know, we're sitting in a museum on a university campus, or practically, talking about prisons. And it strikes me, there are so many ways to reflect on the ways in which institutions have the capacity to generate these overpowering narratives, and that the work of the artists, which you all are, at least in my mind, in different ways, is to challenge and to undermine a lot of those overpowering narratives. But I don't know that there's a point to that point. I just wanted to make it. But I also wanted to also to come back to the point about I know that there are folks here who have been directly impacted by the system, and I wondered if we could just start by sort of opening up whether there are folks who want to share their responses, not just to the presentations, but to the exhibit, whether there are people out there who wanted to reflect on what Jonathan also referred to as that unbridgeable divide between those for whom the prison is essentially an idea.
Thank you. It has to do with your statement about your grandmother visiting every week and you waiting 10 years before you felt you could do it. And how did you justify that to yourself during those 10 years? What was your argument about?
So, actually, the report that I mentioned that, that talked about the impact that incarceration has on children, there was something that was very interesting that stuck out to me, which is the experience of anger that children of incarcerated parents feel. But because they feel so powerless around the separation from their parent, because they internalize it and they wonder, what's wrong with me that my parent isn't here anymore? What actually helps them is when the parent that is incarcerated sends them letters, because then they're able to reject their parent as they feel their parent has rejected them, right? So a lot of my experience was my dad sent me a letter, every couple weeks for 10 years, and I never once responded. I had a whole box that I didn't even open because it was, oh, he left me, but he's still reaching out. I have the power. For someone who feels powerless in the world and invisible and powerless against the institution that is incarceration, that, my father has his responsibility, that's his story, but, for me, feeling very small in a big world, rejecting him was the only way I felt safe, right? And then I'm glad that I eventually went and, did go visit him, because it was a really beautiful experience. And I went home and I opened all those letters and I got to sit through and read them. I mean, I had it was a lot of crying. You did not want to be ugly crying, You did not want to be there. But it was just such a profound experience for me. And, there's no one right path for people who are impacted by incarceration. And I wouldn't necessarily say that I justified not talking to him, but I definitely see it was something that I needed in my process.
Thank you. I wonder also, maybe this is a question for the three of you, but if you could talk more about, or if we could talk more about the point which you've each touched on, which is, what is it about storytelling that has such tremendous power? And I wonder if we could sort of dive a little bit into that question of what is narrative doing? I love your point about Roach's list of animals. What's happening? How is it possible that is it the recitation? Is it the documentation? Is it the voice? But why is that narrative so not just powerful in its own right, but powerful even against, like you're saying, these unimaginably powerful institutions? I don't know if there are thoughts or comments that you all want to share, or others.
Well, I mean, some of this may seem pretty basic, but I mean, we live in a huge world where many people feel isolated, whether you're in prison or not, and it's easy to feel that you don't matter, that you don't take up space. So when you can become interior and bring out something that's important to you and have it heard, all of a sudden it's like getting watered, right? If you're a flower or a vegetable that's not doing very well, and it gives you space. And there's so many difficult things about being in prison, but I imagine one of them is being told over and over again that you don't matter, and that you just float from, or you drift from one kind of command to another without having any power. And there's something simple and powerful in just being heard and being told that you matter. And I have something I was thinking about when I was driving over here in the car. On the podcast, we did an episode of music, and there was one really great song by this guy called Redbone about him being on his bike. And it was before he got to prison, and he was homeless, and he rode his bike everywhere, and he had all these really crazy adventures on his bike. So it became a very popular song on the podcast, and a listener wrote in and showed us a sign that they had made for a bike trail wherever they lived, and it said Redbone, San Quentin, and so it was like Redbone's trail. And I showed it to him, and he was so happy, and he said, "Do you mean that people don't think I'm scary?" And I was like, "No, they don't. They think you're wonderful, and your song's amazing." So it was just like that little thing of someone being told that they mattered and they took up a little bit of space, created this very charming reaction. So I think that is the power of narrative. It doesn't have to be a huge thing. It can be as small as a song and somebody getting mentioned on a bike trail. So that may sound trite, but I think it's actually very powerful. But I think people have to come to it on their own. I was thinking about the question, like, how was it phrased? How did you justify not talking to your father for 10 years? It reminds me of the restorative justice process, which is mostly for victims, and children of people who are incarcerated are also victims. And it takes people a long time to be able to come to that point of wanting reconciliation. And if you try to rush that, it's very false, right? There's no bottom to it. There's nothing that makes it secure, just like if you try to rush out a narrative that doesn't have substance. So all of these things take time, and when you give it time, when you give it that water, then a real connection happens, just like you being able to reconnect with your father. So time is important in all of these narratives. They can't be rushed.
Something that's coming to mind for me is just the insidious nature of incarceration, and how it's not you don't go to prison and then the next day all of a sudden you have that intense like darkness or all of those like pent up feelings. It happens, I think, over time. And so one thing that I think narrative does is give these outlets of letting go of some of that and bringing more, light and love, and as Nigel was saying, more acceptance and more, feeling like you matter. And something that's coming to mind for me too is I'm working, on this children's book, and it's being illustrated by a man in San Quentin, and so we write back and forth to each other about what he's doing with the illustrations. And it's just this really incredible process where we have to keep things very professional into the project, but he'll insert these sentences, saying, I want to put a hummingbird here because my daughter really likes hummingbirds, and she doesn't talk to me, she's mad at me, but I'm going to put it in this photo. And I picture this man who's incarcerated, who's working on this project, just like sharing his story, even just in one sentence or one aspect of this photo. And to me, I think that that's like reversing some of that insidiousness of incarceration. It's just, I think of it too as something that has to do with time, this slow process of unraveling that trauma and healing it with other things. Thank you.
Wow, that's very moving. Let me just say briefly that, if narrative's important, and it is, it's because it's what human dignity is about, having a story and having that story matter to other people. And one of the things that happens in prison is your human dignity gets effaced. That's one of the reasons we might want to consider just not having them, because we built them with the idea that it would somehow protect human dignity compared to torturing people on the scaffold or hanging them, but it ended up dehumanizing, or you actually can't dehumanize people. I mean, that's one of the great things about dignity. The people don't lose their dignity, but the institution does. And if you look at prisons around the world, I mean, ours stand out, not always just in how horrible conditions are, because there are countries where they're even worse, of course, but in the lack of respect for dignity. I mean, people are stripped of their names, given numbers, they're separated off as if they were toxic waste. If you visit prisons in other countries, correctional officers actually mingle with prisoners. They're not distancing the way that we do. So there's a huge amount that strips people of their story. And why I always want us to be a little skeptical about whether rehabilitation is a reason to keep people in prison. I don't think it is. There's a lot of good evidence that, you know, if you want to look for what makes a difference in people desisting from crime, it's recovering their own narrative, having a story to tell about themselves and the power that comes with that.
Yeah. There's a guy that's
Right.
to ask it. Can you just ask his question?
Yes, Jason.
Oh,
go
just quickly. I mean, in reference to this concept of narrative, I think it's a huge responsibility of all anybody that's in the know, anybody that cares. If we're observers of the way things happen today, especially if we rely strictly on like mainstream media to control that narrative, it's going to be seriously skewed. I know that, like, if you talk about the news, every time, you know, I mean, what are there, over 100,000 people paroling in California alone every year? And if you depend on the news to control that narrative, they'll find a way to slip in if a parolee does something bad every time, even if it doesn't fit in the story. But what they're not talking about is what about all the other folks that are not doing those heinous things and doing pretty well for themselves, actually. If we don't speak up for those folks, then that narrative gets lost. I think it adds the balance that we need. So as far as narrative goes, it's extremely important. I think it should be a portion of all of our civic duties, in a sense.
I love the idea of narrative as being part of our civic duty. Tina has arrived. I want to give you a chance to catch your breath. When you're ready, and maybe we can transition temporarily off the stage. Are you good? Amazing. What remarkable timing.
My name is Tina Sachs. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Social Welfare, and I'm really honored to be with you today, this afternoon, as we talk about the really powerful work that Nigel has brought together here, as well as the work, obviously, of the men who are incarcerated at San Quentin. And I just wanted to, I feel terrible to be coming in sort of at the 11th hour here, but I wanted to, as I sort of orient myself to orient all of us to, as we're seated here in this room together, I wanted to just take a moment to, first of all, to ground us in the particular moment. We're coming off the heels of Indigenous Peoples Day. We're also here at the campus of UC Berkeley commemorating the forced arrival of people from Africa 400 years ago in 1619. And so as we think about both the history of the present, essentially, that we are here on a lonely land, that we are a country in many ways that is founded on plunder in many ways. Settler colonialism and the plunder of both bodies, land, and capital. And as I think about the importance of this work and what it means, what the prison means and what it represents, in the present, I think I would be remiss to not anchor it to the past and to the ways in which it is really the present. I think it's impossible to think about why we have prisons without thinking about from whence we come, essentially, as a country. And I think often, too, about Angela Davis, obviously, as sort of as the amazing thinker that she is. And as she reminds us that prisons do not disappear social problems, they disappear human beings. And I think the power of what Nigel has done and what the men have done is to render themselves visible, essentially. They are not disappeared. They are there. And we need to reckon with that. I think this work, the totality of the work forces us to think about, to reckon with why we have prisons. What is the point of these prisons? What are they there for? What are they really doing? And what is the stated goal versus what they actually do? And I think Angela Davis's words force us to contend with that. And so, again, this is not I'm not here to lecture, but I do think it's important to think about this context of how many people we have behind bars here in the Golden State. There are actually about 100,015 men and women imprisoned here in California, and this doesn't count detention facilities, immigration detention facilities, which also detain many other people here in our state. And again, as we're thinking about, or at least I'm thinking about, the history of the country, where we came from, we know that the racial disparities are ever present. And that although black men in this state only represent less than 6% of the population, they represent almost 30% of California's male prisoners. And that these racial inequities are quite stark, as you can see here. That black and Latino men and other men of color are disproportionately incarcerated. And what does that mean? And what are the stories? Last week I had the opportunity to come and view the exhibit, and I was really struck by what happens to people that we lock away, that we turn our eyes away from, essentially. And it was really interesting to me that the guards or the state apparatus itself had documented life inside, and had documented such instances of violence. Both violence, also of survival, essentially, as all humans, I think we have a will to survive regardless of the ways in which we are oppressed. But that really struck me as a researcher of health inequities, of how the ways in which the social world produces ill health and disease as well as well-being. And it made me think about who and what is happening behind those bars that we don't see, and the burden of illness that takes place inside, the ways in which men and women are particularly disadvantaged. So obviously we know that people who are poor, people who are disabled, are much more likely to end up in prison. And that once behind bars, it's tragically, or I don't know if it's tragicomically, sometimes have better access to healthcare behind bars than they do outside, even as abysmal oftentimes as healthcare is inside the prison. And so many of the photos really called me to think about the men, there's so many photos in which they're kind of the vulnerability, the sort of profound vulnerability of the men. One of the photos in particular in which a man is standing there in his underwear, handcuffed from the front and the back. There's a photo of him from the front and the back. And just thinking about why he's handcuffed there like that, in that profound state of vulnerability, the fear in his eyes. And that's one of the respondents, actually, one of the men currently incarcerated, actually wrote that on the photo. It said fear. And it made me think about what happens to people in there, what happens to their bodies, and why. And so I just wanted to present a little bit of data to contextualize those photos and to call us to grapple with what this project is really about. I wanted to draw your attention to the bottom right of your viewing of suicide and violence. And that was one of the things that was profound that stood out to me in the photographs. And suicide accounts for about 1/3 of deaths in jails. And I don't have data on prisons, but I would imagine that suicide rates are relatively high in prisons as well. And just to think about what causes people, obviously, to enact that kind of violence. And I also would argue that the violence that is taking place inside prisons is really an enactment of a state violence, right? It's the violence of a state that has sort of said to all of these very vulnerable people on the outside, well, we don't really care about your health care, we don't really care about your education, we don't really care about your housing needs, and when you do mess up, we will make sure we'll bring you here to teach you how to behave. And the photos were really profoundly sad for me, I think, to just think about that all of those people, I'm sure many, perhaps many of them committed horrible crimes, some of them did not, but all of them were somebody's child at some point. We also know that people are aging behind bars, and so this is one of the things that really makes me question, what are we doing? What is this project really about? What is prison really about? Given that we know that criminality actually declines as people age, and yet the people we have behind bars are aging rapidly. Here in California, we're spending almost $20,000 per person on health care for an aging prison population. And it certainly must beg the question, what could we do with that $20,000 if we put it elsewhere, if we invested in a person elsewhere? And why do we continue to incarcerate people even as their time in which they might be committing crimes is absolutely declining over the life course? I don't really have an answer for all of those things. But what I want to suggest here is that what this exhibit and what prison, I think, calls us to reckon with is, what are we doing collectively? What kinds of social problems are we trying to solve by locking these people up? And how might we do it differently? And so the Afrofuturists, group of intellectuals, artists, always say that we have to think about not only what we want to dismantle, what we want to do away with, but we also have to think about, what do we want? What does a just world actually look like? And so that's what I hope we can also reckon with here today, today in this room and also going forward. And a scholar who I really admire a lot, she signs her books with this phrase, another world is possible. Thank you.
Basically, I have maybe two questions. One was, what are the alternatives that have been kind of being discussed? We're all criticizing the prison system. So what are the alternatives, even to not even reforming the prison system, but abolishing the prison system? That's for you. And for Nigel, I wanted you to talk more, was wondering more about how you come into the prison and how do you select, or how do they select themselves, the people who are going to participate in the program, and are these more artistically oriented people, or are there characteristics of who's attracted to your program and that sort of thing?
That sounds like a harder question. You want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a really important conversation to have, and it's not a conversation that is a one-shot deal. I think we have to have a dialogue about how close we can get to a society that doesn't cage people. It may be a process, but a number of things to think about are, first of all, what do we want from prison? For a lot of people, it's about controlling crime. Well, I think a lot of criminologists now believe that we have much better ways to reduce crime, and that the actual lever of the prison as a way to dissuade people from committing crimes is a very weak one. That to the extent that deterrence works, it's much more about certainty. If you think there's a 1 in 100 chance you're going to be punished for an act, not very likely to change your mind about things. So that's one factor to consider. The other dimension to it is about personal transformation, and I definitely want to acknowledge that people do transform in prison, and that there's important work that can be done, but again, does it have to be done in prisons? Are there other ways to do it? You know, to go back to crime for just a moment, a lot of people don't realize that we thankfully have about half the crime that we had in this country in the early 1990s, and there's been extensive research on it, and what we've shown is that it wasn't prison that did that the states that put the most people in prison did not enjoy the biggest reductions in crime. It wasn't the police that did it. What did it? Criminologists actually need to answer that question better than they have, but I think it's the people themselves. I think a lot of our cities began to heal after decades of mismanagement and urban disruption. So I think if we want to fight crime, there are better ways to do it. If we want to reconcile people, we want to do the hard work of restorative justice. Again, I don't see the prison as a particularly well-suited tool for that. But again, it's not a question of tomorrow all of the cages are gone. It's a question of how close can we get. We're still a society that, we don't have a prison that's smaller than 2,500 people in this state. The best prisons in the world are in Norway. You know what their average prison size is? 54. And they don't have a prison over 200 people.
I want to add also just like one mental exercise that I think is helpful to that question is, what would we do if prisons weren't an option? If they simply weren't on the table? Right? But I also think that there's another important point in what Jonathan said, which is that on the one hand, we imagine that the prison is a rational response to something, and yet we have a lot of not just data, but kind of common sense knowledge that tells us that prisons aren't really the best, or even in many senses, a legitimate tool to achieve the goals we're trying to achieve. So for me, a lot of the question is also parsing out what else is going on when we incarcerate, right? Right. What are we? Right. But not only what are we trying to accomplish, but perhaps what are we enacting when we incarcerate? I would argue that there's a ritualistic dimension. But I want to give Nigel the chance to also respond to your question about the class.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say something about the idea of what do we do about prisons. I don't know. I have no clue. I think one thing that would be helpful is to talk to people who have been through the system and get their ideas on what would have helped them at the time they needed help. I think that's probably the best place to start, because I don't feel qualified in any way to say. I am actually not a prison abolitionist. I think prisons have to exist. I don't think they have to exist as they are now. And maybe the prison is the wrong word, but we need something, and I think the people that can solve it, there's some people in this room right now who probably would have things to say about it. So it's a hard conversation that I don't feel qualified to answer.
Sorry, do you want to respond to the question about the students in your class?
Oh, yeah, so the question was, how do I find the people that I work with? Well, at San Quentin, there's a media lab where we work, and I started the podcast. Well, I started the photographic project through the Prison University project. So that's how I initially met the men that I worked with, and at least 3 of them are here today, which is really exciting. I won't embarrass them. But for the podcast, I spend a lot of time in prison. I mean, I'm sometimes there 5 to 7 days a week working. So since 2011, I've just gotten to know a lot of men. And San Quentin is like a village. It's a small town. So the more time you spend in there, the more you get to know people. And so I found men that felt sympathetic and that they liked me and I liked them and we wanted to work together. So it's very organic, not unlike any kind of collaboration you would do on the outside. So that's how I started working with the guys, and it grew from there. But with the podcast, when we had to find a new co-host, because Earlonne Woods, my co-host, had his sentence commuted and left San Quentin, I was really proud of how we found a new co-host. We advertised for the position, just like you would advertise for a job outside. So we put a job listing out in the prison. We had about 30 people apply. There was a 3-tiered interview process. People had to submit an application, a resume, talk about why they wanted the job. From 30 resumes, we interviewed 8 people. Then we brought 3 people back and did another interview. So I always try to mirror processes outside, inside, so that even though a guy didn't get the job, he had the experience of what it's like to put a resume together, what it's like to have an interview, and I think that's really helpful. And that's just a way of treating people with respect, like you would treat anybody. If I was looking for a collaborator out here, I would network, just like I networked inside San Quentin, and when we were looking to hire someone, I did what I would do out here, which is to put a job ad out and find the right person for the job. So that's how we try to operate.
Tina, you were starting to say something earlier.
I was about to say, if you could replicate walls to bridges, I'm going to say when you replicate it, scale up on a statewide basis, how would you envision it happening in public schools, in communities where there's a very high percentage of incarcerated parents? What would it look like? How could it happen?
That is a very good question. that's actually not something I've given much thought because I'm in my little world that is Santa Cruz, California right now. But there are organizations that are doing restorative justice work in communities. There's a big organization that does restorative justice in Oakland in schools. Walls to Bridges is more focused on doing restorative justice inside of facilities, right? So it's with currently incarcerated parents and their children. At appropriate age, like I said earlier, you go through a process. Most children go through a process of dealing with their feelings and might not be ready, and so that's why it's for late teen and young adult age children. But yeah, I envision just doing this program and creating this model and getting it out there in the world so people who are really passionate about the work have something that they can then take to their own communities and then implement. So ideally, I would hope that other children of incarcerated parents or family members impacted by incarceration would come together with policymakers and leaders and communities to implement this program. I envision it as a very collaborative effort from people across different generations and class and race and gender and education levels, because I think everyone deserves a seat at the table when doing something as important as family reunification.
Sorry, okay.
Hi. I would like to ask a question about narrative and perspective, because I'm kind of following up on what the gentleman said. For the average person who doesn't know personally anyone in prison, the perspective you get is either from the news or from movies and TV series, whether it's Shawshank Redemption or Oz and numerous other ones. How does that shape the narrative, and should change come through these channels as well?
Yeah. I have so much to say about that. And I'm going to talk about the podcast that I do, Ear Hustle, more than the photographic project. So Ear Hustle has just finished its 4th season. We have about 35 episodes out. And if you haven't heard it, again, it's about daily life inside San Quentin. But one of the things that we've really tried to do is have varied emotions in the stories. So, for example, within one episode, there can be really difficult information that comes across, but there's also always humor and longing and intellectual conversation and silliness. And we've gotten very little blowback on the podcast, but I remember the first time I gave a public talk about it, 2 women really aggressively confronted me about using humor in the podcast. And I thought, it's so interesting because that really said so much more about the person asking the question, making the assumption that everybody in prison has one emotion, and that is anger. And so I feel one of the most political things we do with the podcast is to show that life inside prison and people in prison are as multidimensional as anyone else. And it kind of shocks me that people don't think about that. And it's because the press, the news, movies, TV is so poor and one-dimensional when it comes to showing what life is like in prison. And one of the things I think we could all learn from, or would help people shift this deep fear, is to be able to see, it sounds so simplistic, but to be able to see that people in prison are no different, right? I mean, they have families, they love, they have jobs, they go through, medical treatments, and believe it or not, they laugh a lot, right? There is a lot of humor in prison, and I think we need that we need to think about that too, and we need to confront all the really bad media and news.
Sorry.
Just very briefly, I mean, I really appreciate the difference that having Ear Hustle has made. I do think I see some changes in the media. There's beginning to be sort of journalists that focus on mass imprisonment itself, that focus on the story of ill health and things of that nature. They're still competing with a sort of standard narrative that still involves just the same recycled images of scary young men, even if they're now old, gentlemen.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Aaliyah Quiros Pando, and I am an undergrad student at UC Berkeley, specifically in social welfare, just declared. Yeah. And I just wanted to thank all of you guys for speaking and saying such powerful words today. It really inspires me and students alike. I can speak on their behalf. I hope that you guys don't mind. But anyways, I would like to ask you guys a bunch of questions, but the one that's most prominent is for Nigel Poor. I'm a proud and avid listener of Ear Hustle. I've been for a while, and it's my favorite podcast. And I have a specific question for you, because you do act as like a, platform for voices that were historically underrepresented and also ignored. How do you, because I hope one day to also do that as well, to give voices, or to give a platform rather, for voices to speak. And I guess I wanted to know, how do you make sure to capture all the complexities of individuals? So again, those are the only representative voices that they're, given, and like, how do we do that in such a respectful and powerful way?
Yeah, well, we spend a lot of time working on stories, first of all, and we do a lot of pre-work before we get to the story. So we try, in the lab where we record people, we try to set up a very comfortable situation where people feel like they can talk freely, and that we practice compassionate listening and not judging people as they're telling our stories. But we also have to a lot of times push people to be real and to not, Jody brought this up at the beginning, that there's kind of this obsession with the redemption story, and that everything can be tied up so neatly, and you're only worth investigating if you have this beautiful story of redemption. So sometimes guys will come to us and want to tell that kind of story, and we really have to push back and say, that's not what we're here for. We're here to tell something that might be ugly and complex and beautiful and all those things mixed together. So I don't know if that answers your question, but the thing is to really think about who this individual is in front of you, what do they have to say, and how can we collaborate on a story and go through a relationship while we're creating that story. And relationships aren't always easy, right? I mean, sometimes, there's tears, I'm very uncomfortable, guys may get upset, but all that stuff has to happen in order to make a story that, to my mind, is a real story about somebody's experience. So I just think it takes a lot of time, and it also takes really good editing to cut out a lot of the bullshit on both sides. And it also takes a lot, on my part and Erlon and everyone else who's working on it, to really confront our own assumptions and try to not go in with a big agenda, like to be open and allow for it to go wherever it's going to go. But we work with editors also, and I think that's really important for people to know with the podcast. There's a ton of writing that goes into it, and it may sound like it's just off the cuff, but it's not. There's lots of retakes, lots of editing. And the last story that we just did, called Tell Christy I Love Her, I think we spent 9 months about working on that story. So does that answer your question? I hope so.
Yes, thank you. What about the fellow in?
John's time.
Yes. John, please. Wait, Jimmy, let him talk.
So,
Hold on.
Elisa said something about time for the narrative, and I think that's really good, but it also needs space. And Ms. Poor opened up a space for the narrative, which is really interesting. And I think Dr. Lewen is here.
You can call me Jody, Jimmy.
Because she noticed that narrative is what really drives the people who are incarcerated. They have this narrative that is really unusual, and it keeps them together, and it's really beautiful, and there's beauty in the narrative in the prison. And Ms. Poor came in and captured it. And I don't know the last lady that came in, but I really like
Tina Sachs.
Are possible, and just look at what comes out of the prisons. There's some really interesting stuff coming out of the prisons.
Yeah. I want to make a comment to that, unless there's somebody waiting to ask a question. Am I talking too much? Jimmy just mentioned something about finding space, and it reminded me of a story from one of my students who took a photography class. And
And at the end of in the class, we looked at a lot of work, and we talked about how do you delve into work and find the subtext and the narrative there. And at the end of the class, he said, like, the best compliment I've ever got from a student, which was, after taking this class, I can now see fascination everywhere. And that, to me, was the power of self-discovery, that this person who was in prison, not in a great situation, was able to find fascination. Not just, I don't think he was talking about the photographs. He was talking about his experience now engaging with the world, that no matter where he was, he could find fascination. And to me, that meant he was keyed into who he was and what he had to give. So I think that talks about what the power of creating a space for people then to make their own discoveries. And that space might be in prison. You know, it could be in various situations that are good, bad, or indifferent, but it can happen. That self-discovery can happen in really dark, terrible places. Thanks, Ruben.
Yeah.
Hi, I just have a question about how the exhibit was curated. So, like, how did you select pieces for the exhibit, and also what was the involvement of the incarcerated people that made a lot of those images and things? And also, do they know that their artwork is being shown, and are they being compensated at all in that regard?
Well, I don't know if, I'm not going to call them out, but there's some people here who participated in it, so they might be able to answer some of the questions about how they felt about doing it. Nobody was compensated for this exhibit. This is not an exhibit that makes money, so that's just not possible. Yes, the guys I worked with helped pick the pictures. I would bring a bunch of images into the prison, and together we would select what was going to be worked on. I usually brought in about 20 images, and the guys would pick what they wanted to work on. Whenever I have an exhibit, because a lot of the guys I worked with were still in prison, I document whatever I can to share with them. But a lot of the people that participated are now out, and so they're able to see it. The exhibit opened in Milwaukee, and I was able to bring 2 guys out there who had gotten out to see it. A couple weeks ago, we had kind of a reunion here with about 30 guys that have gotten out of prison, and we all came to see the exhibit together. So as much as it is possible, I try to share everything. But, you know, the fact is, when you're in prison, you can't get out to come see things. But we try to find ways to share it, and I think that the guys that get out share the experience with guys that are in. So it's as collaborative as it can possibly be, but of course it's never going to be an equal situation.
John.
Hello, I would just like to comment on a couple of things that were said by Tina and Simon and everybody. I know some of you well. I'm John Neblett. I paroled in 2015 after 30 years, and then went to SFSU and completed my degree in performing arts. And next Saturday is an audition for No Exit. So this existential exercise here that we're having, and bringing people who are behind the wall, on the other side of the wall, for other people to see through art or through our narrative, is I'm very glad to participate. So to get back to plunder and why these institutions exist, we still operate under a patriarchy where we elect a king every 4 years, and he's got to distribute the spoils. And any threat to that narrative, of course, you know, we make it into a yes-no polarized conversation in order to keep it dumb. And this forum is existing to bring us beyond the dumbness of silence and the dumbness of bad argument, the dumbness of 6th grade education presidents, you know? So for me, to hear what's going on today is, you know, we're taking down the bricks one at a time. And it might be provocative to hear the word plunder. It might be provocative to hear about Marxist theory in here, with Jimmy commenting on workers versus slaves, because we're human beings, and, you know, workers gives us a little bit more, a step up in the hierarchy, which I think is a mistake. I think we're all human, and we're all part of humanity. And that's what being able to tell our story is about, to bring us all back to humanity. And thank you, Jody Lewen.
Thank you, John Neblett. Other comments or questions? We have a comment here. Can I give her my mic? Is that, they're all the same? Okay, okay. Let me not mess up the system. Thank you.
I think that you said something about the men that were part of the education, part of the program, when they were released, that the recidivization rate was lower. So that's great. And now I'm thinking of how to make that in the reverse, so that men, women don't end up in prison. So that we don't have to have these prisons. Your father doesn't have to be separated from you, What is it that we can do? Is it education? I mean, there's a lot of things, social things, about criminology, how to make that happen, because your talk today helps me see that, yes, we're giving some men some voice, which is through these narratives, but what about the 6-year-old and 8-year-old that's not paid attention to by their teacher or their mother or their father's not there? Where's their narrative? How does that get to be heard so that they don't end up somewhere where they don't want to be,
I'm going to give Tina a chance to respond. I can feel that.
Thank you for that. That was important.
So thank you so much for that question. I was feeling like this burning desire to jump in and say something here, because I think, the United States actually spends far less than any other industrialized country on so many of the inputs that we actually have a pretty good, idea would prevent imprisonment. So education, housing, healthcare, the infrastructure on the outside. It's no accident that the same people in the same communities cycle in and out of prison. It is not accidental. And again, I also really bristle at the idea of these redemption stories, because I'm kind of like, I think if people, this is certainly not for every single person in prison. I don't mean to paint an imprecise picture here. But we know overwhelmingly that people end up in prison because they don't have access to the things that would keep them out of prison. Many people end up in prison because they're mentally ill. Many people end up in prison because they're engaging in survival crimes. And many people end up in prison because of the intergenerational impact of having a parent who has been separated from them. One of the major drivers of a rise of people who enter the foster care system is because of incarceration. People who are in the foster care system are much more likely to be homeless, engage in survival crimes, and then end up in prison. None of this is accidental. And this is not really about, to my mind, this is not about this sort of personal redemption story. This is a structural story. And if we want to do something about it, if we want to get rid of prisons, what we can do is actually invest in the inputs that prevent them. And what those inputs are actually not unknown to us. It's a matter of political will, as far as I'm concerned, not necessarily not knowing.
Yeah. I have a comment right here.
I'm such a huge fan of Nigel's work, as I told you earlier, and an avid listener of Ear Hustle. I feel like it's profoundly impacted my life. I'm curious about the other panelists, how you view the exhibit and the podcast as impacting the work that you do. You could all answer, or just one.
Well, I would say, as somebody who spends a lot of time teaching about the prison, that I have found in recent years just an enormous opportunity to let my students learn from the inside in a way that I can't replicate as a teacher, that they can hear those voices, that there are so many routes now by which narratives, whether textual narratives or voice narratives, are finding their way out there. And to me, it's turned around really the educational environment in which I teach about the prison. I don't need to give them academic articles to create that reality for them.
I would just add to that, when we went to Milwaukee, when the show first went up, Michael Nelson came out to see it, and he had only been out for a couple of months.
and had, I believe, never been in a museum before. And we walked into the room, and he could hear his own voice, the recording of his own voice, over the sound system. And it took this sort of video kind of behind him, because I thought it would be an intense experience. But what was powerful for me was how powerful it was for him. And also, other folks inside, as Nigel mentioned, have heard about the show, right? And so not just the people who are featured in some way or whose work is featured in some way, but the community in general. And so, for example, people will hear about this forum, right? And so I think the way I imagine the work sort of impacting, and the show, I should say, both really impacting our work of providing education inside, is giving folks inside the feeling and the realization, confronting them with the reality that they can actually have an impact, that they can be heard. I see all of this as a kind of extraordinary collaboration between people inside and outside. And I think, like one of the folks earlier kind of implied, it's not perfect, right? These partnerships are terribly fraught with power dynamic, imbalances and all sorts of very complex questions about representation, and yet we all persevere, right? And somehow are really sort of churning and transforming the narrative. So, but I feel like that Nigel's work in particular has really just created sort of a wind underneath the wings of a lot of the efforts that are kind of going on, activist efforts, educational, programmatic efforts, advocacy efforts to also, in particular, kind of broadcast that reality, right, of the humanity of people who are inside, right? And I also just wanted to add quickly to the point about recidivism. You can freeze to death under a bridge and not recidivate. So recidivism is a terrible metric of an individual's well-being. And I think that's also the message that I just encourage everybody to carry, with them, is that the critical decision is, are we talking about human beings or not? And when we talk about prisons, I think one of the most important things we can do is always make sure that we are reminding ourselves and each other, these are human beings that we're talking about, and their lives matter. And to begin the conversation at that point, rather than the sort of the model of the hazardous waste that has to somehow be abated, so that the rest of us can be safe. One more question or comment? Sorry.
Did you want to say something?
I actually want to share a really funny story about ear hustle. My my dad, Elisa Tambora, he was actually on an episode of Ear Hustle, and when it came out, I had a whole bunch of people texting me saying, "Was your dad in prison? Because we just heard your last name on Ear Hustle," right? And I had to call my dad. He was at work, and I said, "Oh my God, you told everyone you spent your gate money on Starbucks. Like, now everyone knows that my father got released from prison and went and got a pumpkin spice latte. You are so embarrassing." But it was just, I really appreciate Nigel's work because it is uplifting the voices, right? And I get to have this really funny experience with my dad as, his kid saying, "You're embarrassing me." I didn't get to do that growing up because he wasn't around to embarrass me. So thank you for your work and giving me the opportunity to have normal child experiences.
I love that.